Thanks. Can you talk a little bit more about the state of a two-state solution, and why you feel that partition is no longer possible, and just about the commitment to a two-state solution that remains among so many American politicians?
Yeah, so I think it's first, addressed this a bit in an essay I wrote last year for Jewish Currents called Yavna, which was an argument for equality in one political entity in Israel-Palestine. I think the first thing to recognize about the two-state solution is that even under the best of circumstances, there are very fundamental issues that it would not have solved. So for instance, even if Palestinians had their own state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, 20% of Israel's own citizens in Israel proper are Palestinians. They sometimes get called Arab Israelis, but they're Palestinians. And those Palestinians who represent 20% and could over time represent 30% of the Israeli population are second-class citizens, because the nature of a Jewish state by its very nature suggests that the state has obligations to its Jewish citizens that it does not have to them. And this plays itself out in a whole series of ways that mean that Palestinian citizens do not enjoy equality. And just as, most American Jews would not be comfortable in a country that privileged Christians over Jews, most Palestinian citizens understandably want equality under the law. They don't want to be second-class citizens. So a two-state solution would not have solved that. As conventionally understood, a two-state solution would also not have allowed Palestinian refugees to return to within Israel proper, at least not in any significant number. And I think there are also some very kind of, as I wrote in a piece just recently called Tshuva, a Jewish case for Palestinian refugee return, I think that there are very basic questions of justice, particularly about whether we as Jews who returned to what we call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, after 2,000 years, have the right to deny Palestinians who were expelled 75 years ago, or their children or grandchildren. But I think one could have said that the two-state solution was at least a step forward in the process of a more fundamental solution, because it would have ended one particularly oppressive reality, which was the millions of Palestinians in the West Bank who live under military law, the Palestinians in Gaza who live under blockade, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem who are not Israeli citizens. And yet I think that the reality is that Israel's control over the West Bank is now probably too deeply entrenched to imagine that partition taking place. It's interesting, if you go back to the early 1980s, you can find prominent Israeli commentators like Amos Oz and American commentators like Thomas Friedman basically saying, the two-state solution is virtually on its last legs because we now have 150,000 settlers in the West Bank. You now have 650,000, including East Jerusalem. And even that really understates the extent of it. If any of you have been there, nothing about this looks temporary. It's virtually impossible to find a Hebrew language map put out by the state of Israel that even acknowledges the boundary between the West Bank and Israel, thoroughly integrated into the state, massive infrastructure, Israel's newest medical school, vast industrial and agricultural enterprises. So this is really nothing, and Israel's also now controlled the West Bank for more than 2/3 of its history. Israel was only a country for less than 20 years before it controlled the West Bank, and it's now controlled it for more than 50. So I think it makes more sense to think about this territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea as one integrated political unit, and then think about how it could be that one could have safety and justice and freedom for both populations in that territory.